My fiancée said her friend was gay. I walked in, saw her in his shirt, and realized she'd been sleeping with a married man. When I first met Lila, I thought she was the kind of person who could brighten a dead room. She had this energy that drew people in, confident, loud enough to dominate a group conversation, soft enough to seem harmless one-on-one. We'd been together almost 3 years when I proposed, and I genuinely believed I'd won the lottery. We weren't perfect, nobody is, but she made the ordinary feel alive. Things started changing around the time she got her new client, a boutique furniture company downtown. That's where she met Adrian. She mentioned him casually at first. "He's hilarious," she'd said over dinner, twirling her fork. "You'd love him. He's gay, by the way, so don't start your jealous man thing." I laughed it off. I wasn't jealous. At least not yet. Adrian became a regular part of her sentences after that. "Adrian said this. Adrian thinks that couch is ugly. Adrian made me try sushi for lunch." It was constant, like he'd quietly taken a seat at our table. I didn't think much of it. I'd met some of her coworkers before, and she was always friendly. But the frequency made me pause. She never talked about her other colleagues with that much enthusiasm. One night, I got home from work around 9. Lila was sitting cross-legged on the couch, still dressed, laptop open, half-empty wine glass beside her. The TV was playing quietly in the background, but she wasn't watching. I asked how her day went, and she told me she'd been helping Adrian pick paint colors for his new apartment. "He's terrible at choosing neutrals," she said, laughing. "You'd think a designer would know better." I joked that she should start charging him consulting fees. She grinned and said, "He pays me in pizza and gossip." It sounded innocent, like the kind of thing she said to sound playful. But that night, when I crawled into bed, she stayed up texting for another hour. I heard the quiet buzzes through the wall. Over the next few weeks, she started spending more evenings out. She'd mentioned she was grabbing dinner with Adrian or helping him unpack. Once, she came home past midnight smelling faintly of cologne, not mine. She explained that she'd hugged him goodbye and he'd just gone overboard with his new scent. She said it laughing, rolling her eyes. I didn't know how to respond, so I smiled and brushed it off. The next day, I met my friend Troy for lunch. I told him about Adrian, about the late nights, the new dynamic. Troy just raised his eyebrows and said, "You sure he's gay, man? Because that sounds like a setup." I laughed, but a seed of doubt started to take root. Lila was clever. She knew how to keep things balanced, one moment distant, the next affectionate. She'd come home with takeout, kiss me on the cheek, ask about my day like nothing was wrong. Then she'd mention Adrian again, casually, like she was testing how much I'd let slide. She said he wanted to be her man of honor at the wedding. I remember pretending that was funny. Then came the first real crack. I was paying our credit card bill one night when I noticed an Uber charge to an address across town. It was logged at 1:08 a.m. The note on the receipt said Adrian's Loft. I asked her about it the next morning. She barely looked up from her makeup mirror and said she'd gone over to help him with wallpaper samples. I raised an eyebrow. At 1 in the morning? She smiled at me through the mirror and said, "Stop worrying. He's gay." That line stuck in my head like a bad echo. He's gay. She said it with such confidence, like it was an irrefutable fact that ended all discussion. It was disarming, almost manipulative. I wanted to believe it because the alternative meant the woman I loved was lying to my face. So I believed it. But believing didn't stop the weirdness. A few days later, I noticed her engagement ring sitting on the nightstand. She rarely took it off. When I asked, she said it scratched the paint when she and Adrian were working on his DIY headboard. She rolled her eyes like it was such a dumb, practical thing. Still, it left an ache in my stomach. The next weekend, she had another design day at Adrian's. I told her I'd tag along this time, just to meet the guy properly. Her reaction was instant, too fast. She said he'd be uncomfortable because he doesn't open up to new people easily. That didn't make sense. She just told me last week that Adrian makes friends everywhere. When she left that day, I noticed something strange. She was wearing a men's gray shirt, not one of mine. I asked where she got it. She said Adrian gave it to her as a paint shirt. It didn't even have paint stains. That night, she came home late again, said they'd ordered pizza and watched an old movie. She was glowing, the kind of relaxed, loose happiness I hadn't seen in a while. I wanted to be happy for her, but my gut was screaming something else. A few days later, I found myself scrolling through her Instagram stories, half out of curiosity, half paranoia. She'd posted a shot of a pizza box on a marble counter with the caption, "Late Night Brainstorm Pizza Da." There was a reflection in the glass oven door, 2 legs, bare, one crossed over the other. I stared at it until my vision blurred. That night, she fell asleep early on the couch. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. The text preview read, "Can't sleep without you." My chest tightened. My first thought was that it couldn't be Adrian. She said he was gay. It had to be a friend, a joke, some stupid misunderstanding. But when I opened it, I saw his name. Adrian. The message before that read, "You left your shirt again, winky face." I felt my throat close. My heart was pounding so hard it was hard to breathe. I put the phone back where it was and sat there in silence, staring at the dark screen. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I made coffee, packed my work bag, and kissed her on the forehead before leaving. She smiled like nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake the image of that message. At work, I replayed every conversation, every excuse, every "he's gay" line. It all started to unravel in my mind like a badly tied knot. That evening, I decided to test her. I told her I was working late on a project, but I parked near Adrian Street around 10. The lights in his apartment were on. I could see two shadows moving inside, one tall, one smaller. I sat there for a long time, not wanting to believe what my eyes were seeing. At midnight, I drove home. She came in half an hour later, humming softly, holding a pizza box. She said they'd been testing layouts. I nodded, pretending to listen, my stomach turning over itself. When she went to shower, I checked the pizza box. Half-eaten, 2 slices missing. One was folded the way I eat mine. That's when something broke inside me. Quietly, without sound. I wasn't going to accuse her. Not yet. But the doubt had turned into certainty. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed that night, staring at her ring on the dresser, at the faint smell of smoke and pepperoni lingering on her clothes, at the quiet rhythm of her breathing. Everything that had once felt secure now felt staged. Rehearsed lines, props, alibis. I didn't know it yet, but that was the night the relationship truly ended. The night before everything came crashing down. The next day, she texted me before lunch. "Stop worrying, he's gay." And I believed it. For the last time. The text kept replaying in my head all day. "Stop worrying, he's gay." It was almost funny how effective that line had been. She'd used it like a shield, and I'd fallen for it again and again. But now, after that night and the pizza box and the smell on her clothes, it didn't sound reassuring anymore. It sounded like a warning. That week, I didn't sleep much. I'd wake up around 2 or 3, restless, replaying conversations, cross-examining them like a detective in my own life. She was still smiling, still talking about the wedding, but something behind her words had shifted. She seemed lighter, as if she'd already stepped out of the relationship but forgot to take her body with her. Then came the night I decided to stop guessing. It was a Friday. Lila said she'd be helping Adrian with some mood board presentation for his clients. She dressed in jeans and a simple top, said it would just be a few hours. I kissed her goodbye like usual. As soon as she left, I waited 10 minutes and followed. I didn't have a plan, just an address I'd memorized from that Uber receipt. The drive took about half an hour. Adrian's apartment was on the top floor of a renovated warehouse near the river, modern, minimal, expensive looking. I parked across the street and sat there for a while, watching the lights through the big corner windows. I told myself I was crazy, that I'd probably just see them moving furniture or sorting fabric swatches. Still, my hands were shaking on the wheel. When I finally got out, I carried a bottle of red wine I'd picked up from the store on the way. It was my excuse. If anyone asked, I'd say I wanted to thank Adrian for helping Lila with the wedding. My heart was pounding as I climbed the narrow stairs. I could hear faint music from inside, something soft, jazzy, completely out of place for a work night. At the door, I paused. Laughter drifted through the crack. A man's low voice said something I couldn't make out. Then Lila's voice followed. Quiet, then sharp, then laughing again. I took a deep breath and knocked. The laughter stopped. For a few seconds, nothing. Then footsteps approached. The door opened halfway. Lila stood there barefoot, her hair messy, wearing a large gray shirt that hung halfway down her thighs, the same one I'd seen before. She froze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Behind her, on the couch, sat Adrian. Shirtless, a slice of pizza in his hand. The wine bottle felt like it weighed 100 pounds. My throat went dry. I didn't say a word. I just looked at her, then at him. The silence stretched like wire. Finally, Adrian stood up. He tried to smile. That fake, too friendly expression people wear when they're cornered. Lila stepped aside like she wanted to explain something, but I just turned around and walked down the stairs. She called after me once, but I didn't stop. Outside, the air was cold. I got into the car, started the engine, and just sat there staring through the windshield. My reflection looked like someone else's face, blank, drained, almost calm. I waited for the anger, the explosion, but it didn't come. Just this hollow quiet, like the sound had been sucked out of the world. I drove aimlessly for hours. The city blurred past, glowing signs, traffic lights, strangers crossing streets. Somewhere along the way, I pulled over near the waterfront. I remember getting out, walking along the edge, listening to the water slap against the rocks. That's when the images started replaying. Her bare legs, his shirt, the half-eaten pizza, the way they both froze when they saw me. Around 3 in the morning, I finally drove home. She'd texted me a dozen times. The last one read, "Please just let me explain." I didn't answer. By the next afternoon, there were 20 more messages. She tried everything: confusion, denial, guilt, logic. It's not what it looked like. He's confused about his sexuality. I was comforting him. We were drunk. He's still gay? Connor, you know that. Each excuse contradicted the last. I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I turned off my phone and left it in the drawer. When I came home from work that evening, her car was in the driveway. She was sitting on the porch, eyes red, wrapped in a blanket like some fragile victim of a crime she'd committed herself. I walked past her without saying anything. She followed me inside. I remember her voice trembling, the way her words tumbled out like she was trying to outrun the truth. She said she'd gone to Adrian's because he'd been drinking after a fight with his boyfriend, that they'd talked, cried, shared pizza, and then crossed a line. She kept saying we didn't mean for it to happen, like that made it any less real. I listened quietly, leaning against the counter. She asked me to say something. I didn't. She started crying harder, clutching her chest, as if pain could make her more believable. When she finally stopped, I told her I was going to stay with my friend Troy for a while. She begged me not to go, saying it would destroy her reputation, that she'd already blocked Adrian, that it was over. I said nothing. I packed a bag, walked out, and closed the door behind me. That night at Troy's place, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I couldn't stop seeing it. The shirt, the pizza, the silence. But what bothered me most wasn't the cheating itself. It was the lie. The deliberate, calm way she'd looked me in the eyes and said, "Stop worrying. He's gay." The next few days were quiet. She sent messages, left voicemails, even emailed me long letters about rebuilding trust. She blamed alcohol, loneliness, misunderstanding emotional boundaries. I didn't reply. I was still too stunned by how quickly everything had unraveled. Then, out of nowhere, she texted a photo. It was a picture of the two of us at a friend's wedding from last year. Underneath it she wrote, "Don't throw this away over one mistake." One mistake. That phrase hit harder than I expected. It wasn't one mistake. It was months of lies, manipulation, and rehearsed stories. I stared at the photo for a long time, then deleted it. A few nights later, I stopped by my apartment to grab more clothes. Her car wasn't there, but the living room light was on. I walked inside and froze. The gray shirt, his shirt, was folded neatly on the couch. Next to it was a pizza box with a note, "For when you're ready to talk." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was pathetic. That was her apology, a shirt that wasn't mine and a slice of cold pizza. I packed the rest of my things in silence. When I left, I dropped the shirt in the dumpster. It landed with a dull thud, and for some reason, that sound felt like closure. Still, part of me wanted answers. I needed to know if Adrian had been playing the same game, or if he'd been dragged into it. So, a week later, I did something I'd sworn I wouldn't. I drove back to his apartment. He wasn't home, but his neighbor, a middle-aged guy with a dog, was out front. I asked if Adrian was around. The man looked surprised and said, "He's been gone all week. Flew to Miami with his husband." That word stopped me cold. Husband. I asked him to repeat it. He nodded. "Yeah, Diego. He's a photographer or something. Comes around every few months." I thanked him and walked away, my pulse hammering. Adrian wasn't gay in theory, he was gay in marriage. So what the hell had Lila been doing with him? And more importantly, did Diego know? By the time I got back to my car, I already knew what I had to do next. If she'd lied about this, there was no telling how deep it went. I needed the truth, all of it. The discovery that Adrian had a husband flipped everything upside down. It meant Lila hadn't just lied to protect her secret. She'd built an entire story on top of another person's marriage. That changed the shape of everything. It wasn't just betrayal, it was calculation. She hadn't stumbled into this. She'd planned around it, counting on Adrian's reputation to cover her tracks. For 2 days, I didn't tell her what I knew. I needed to see what she'd say without prompting. When she texted again asking to talk like adults, I agreed. She came over the next evening wearing a long coat and no makeup, trying to look broken and sincere. She sat on the edge of the couch like a defendant waiting for sentencing. She started with an apology that sounded like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. She said she was ashamed, that she missed me, that Adrian had manipulated her. I listened, silent, my jaw tight. Then she said, "He told me his relationship was over anyway." That was my opening. I asked, "His relationship with who?" She blinked. "With his partner." "Partner or husband?" I said. She froze. I could see the panic flare behind her eyes, the way her face dropped, the way she tried to recover by pretending she'd already told me. "I didn't think it mattered," she said. "They were separated." "They weren't." I knew that. I told her about the neighbor, about the flight to Miami, about Diego. Her face drained of color. She didn't even bother denying it this time. She just covered her mouth with her hands and whispered, "Oh God." She tried to turn it into pity again. She said she was lonely, that she'd made a connection she didn't understand. I could almost admire the audacity, how she kept framing everything like she'd been the victim of her own mistake. But the act was collapsing. I wasn't her audience anymore. When she realized I wasn't going to respond, she stood up and said she'd give me space. I told her not to come back. She left quietly. The door clicked shut like a gavel. That night, I sat at my desk and started canceling everything. The venue, the florist, the caterer, the photographer, the band. Every deposit, every booking, every plan. Some of them charged cancellation fees. I didn't care. When they asked for reasons, I gave the same answer. Event canceled due to infidelity. The silence on the other end of the calls was strangely satisfying. I messaged the jeweler next. Our ring had a clause in the warranty that allowed partial refunds if the engagement was broken under extreme circumstances. I filed the paperwork and attached a single sentence under reason for return. The bride slept with a married man. The next morning, her mother called. I wasn't surprised. I'd been expecting it. She started the conversation with that soft, trembling tone people use when they think guilt will make you cooperative. She said Lila had told her everything, that she was in pieces, that she'd made a terrible mistake but wanted to fix it. I asked her if Lila had mentioned that Adrian was married. She went silent. I said, "You raised a brilliant liar, Mrs. Keating. I hope you're proud." Then I hung up. 2 hours later, I got a text from Lila. "Why did you tell my mom that? You're making things worse." I didn't reply. I spent the next few days cleaning out the apartment, boxing up photos, clothes, gifts, anything that had her fingerprint on it. I left the ring on the kitchen counter. I didn't smash it like some dramatic movie scene. I just used a pair of pliers and bent it until it cracked in half. I sent her a picture of it with one line. "So is the engagement." After that, she stopped messaging me for a while. But the quiet didn't last. On Friday night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was short. "This is Diego. Can we talk?" I stared at it for a long time. I hadn't expected him to reach out. I wrote back about what. He replied with a photo, a screenshot of Lila's messages to Adrian. One of them said, "He actually believed you're gay. I could rob a bank and he'd apologize for not trusting me sooner." Underneath, Diego wrote, "I think we've both been lied to." We met the next day at a cafe near the waterfront. Diego looked nothing like I'd imagined. Mid-30s, calm, well-dressed, with that kind of patience that comes from being tired of drama. He told me Adrian had confessed everything the night before. The affair, the lies, even the gay best friend cover story. Apparently, Lila had convinced Adrian that I was emotionally abusive, that she was trapped in a cold relationship and needed comfort. I felt something dark twist inside me. Not only had she cheated, she'd rewritten me into the villain to justify it. Diego showed me more screenshots. Lila had been sending Adrian photos from our apartment, our bedroom, our dinners, even a selfie of her wearing my hoodie with the caption, "He still thinks I'm painting walls." It was like watching my life get hollowed out piece by piece. When I finished scrolling, Diego said, "I'm filing for divorce. I'm also talking to Adrian's firm. They don't take well to scandals." I nodded. "What do you want from me?" He said, "Nothing. Just wanted you to know you're not crazy." That simple sentence hit harder than any revenge could have. We sat there for a while, two strangers linked by the same betrayal. Before leaving, he handed me a USB drive. "In case you need proof for whatever reason," he said. "Screenshots, emails, photos. Keep it." After he left, I went to my car and stared at the drive in my hand. Proof of everything. The lies, the manipulation, the messages she'd sent while lying beside me at night. I didn't use it immediately. I just kept it, a silent reminder that I hadn't imagined anything. That night, I got another call from Lila's mother. This time, she wasn't gentle. She accused me of ruining her daughter's life by spreading rumors. I told her they weren't rumors. She asked how I could humiliate her family like this. I said, "Ask your daughter how many families she's ruined." Then I hung up again. By the following week, word started getting around. The wedding planner dropped her as a client. A mutual friend told me Lila's company was investigating her for unprofessional behavior because she'd used corporate funds for design meetings that were actually nights at Adrian's apartment. She'd signed off on the invoices herself. I didn't need to lift a finger. Everything was collapsing on its own. One evening, I came home to find an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a handwritten letter from Lila. She said she'd lost everything: her job, her friends, her dignity. She blamed Adrian for taking advantage of her emotions, said she was seeing a therapist, asked if I could ever forgive her. At the bottom, she'd written, "I still have your ring half. Maybe someday we can make it whole again." I burned it in the sink. By then, Diego had followed through on his promise. Adrian's firm had terminated him for breach of ethical standards. Clients were backing out. His reputation was gone. The story spread quietly. Not tabloids, not public scandal, just whispered circles that closed in until there was nowhere left to run. I didn't feel triumphant. Just finished. The wedding that had once felt like the center of my life now existed only as a string of cancellation emails and refunded invoices. My future had become an inbox of automated apologies. But I was free. And Lila? She was about to learn what happens when the lies finally turn on their maker. The following weeks passed in a strange rhythm. Quiet mornings, long walks, then sudden bursts of messages from people I hadn't heard from in months. Word had spread further than I expected. Friends who'd been invited to the wedding texted to ask if the rumors were true. I didn't answer any of them. The truth was out there. I didn't need to tell it myself. It was doing its work without my help. Diego called again, just once. He said Adrian had moved out of their place in Miami after being served divorce papers. Apparently, Adrian's clients had dropped him, his design studio had dissolved, and the company that funded his projects had frozen his accounts pending investigation. He's crashing with a friend now, Diego said. No one wants to be associated with him. There was a pause. Then Diego said, Lila reached out to me too. That made my stomach turn. What for? He said, apology, I think. Or pity. Hard to tell the difference with her. That was the last time I spoke to him. The fallout for Lila came fast. Her company placed her on administrative leave after discovering discrepancies in the corporate expense reports. Apparently, she'd billed some of her nights out with Adrian as client entertainment. When they confronted her, she blamed miscommunication. They didn't buy it. She sent me another letter, this one typed and polite, like it was written for a courtroom. I've lost everything. You don't have to destroy what's left. She was wrong. I didn't have to destroy anything. She'd done it herself. One evening, I was driving home from work when I saw her car parked near my building. I didn't want a scene, but curiosity won. She was sitting on the steps, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, pale, exhausted, clutching a takeout coffee she probably hadn't touched. When she saw me, she stood up too fast, almost tripping over the curb. She started talking before I even said a word. She said she hadn't been sleeping, that people were calling her names online, that she'd lost her apartment. Then she started crying, the kind of crying that was loud enough to attract attention but not enough to be real. I listened quietly. When she ran out of breath, I asked her one question. If I hadn't walked in that night, how long were you planning to keep lying? She didn't answer. She just stared at me like the answer might rewrite history. When I turned to leave, she reached out and grabbed my arm. I stopped. She whispered, Please, Connor, just talk to me. You were the only thing that ever felt real. That line almost worked. Almost. But I could still see the pizza box, the shirt, the reflection in the oven door. I pulled my arm away and said, So was I, until you traded it for a lie. Then I walked inside, leaving her standing there in the cold. The next morning, the apartment manager called to tell me there'd been an incident. Lila had spent the night crying in her car outside the complex. Security eventually asked her to leave. She'd refused until they threatened to call the police. I told them I wasn't pressing charges, but made it clear she wasn't welcome near the property again. After that, she disappeared from my life completely. Meanwhile, Diego messaged one final update. He'd sold off their shared assets and left the country to stay with his family in Spain. Adrian, he said, was under legal review for misusing client funds. There was talk of civil litigation from one of his sponsors. His reputation in the design world was dead. It was poetic in a way. The two of them, who'd built their affair on deception and self-image, now reduced to the same thing, ruin. I wasn't celebrating, but I won't lie and say it didn't satisfy something deep inside me. A month later, a letter from the jeweler arrived. The refund had been processed, half the cost of the engagement ring, deposited directly into my account. It wasn't much compared to what I'd lost, but it felt symbolic. I transferred the money to a savings account and labeled it Recovery Fund. That weekend, I went through my remaining things, old photos, the guest list, the honeymoon brochures, and dumped them all into a cardboard box. I didn't burn it or throw it away dramatically. I just carried it to the local donation center. When the woman at the counter asked what was inside, I said, memories. She laughed, thinking I was joking. A few days later, I took a small trip up north. I stayed at a quiet inn near the coast, the kind of place where nobody asks where you're from or what you're running from. The first night, I walked along the beach and realized something that hadn't crossed my mind in months. I could breathe again. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. When I got home, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a folded note and a Polaroid photo. The photo showed a desk covered in wine bottles and torn paper. In the corner, A figure, Adrian, asleep on a couch. The note said, "He's living with his sister now. She's the only one who'll talk to him." There was no signature, but I knew it was from Lila. I didn't reply. I didn't care. Their world was shrinking, and mine was finally expanding again. Still, I couldn't help but think about how easily it had all happened. How one text, "Stop worrying, he's gay," had been enough to blind me for months. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung, it was how simple it had been. How much trust I'd handed over without question. In a way, that was the real lesson. Trust doesn't break in an explosion. It erodes quietly until one day you realize you've been standing on sand. By the time spring came, I'd moved to Portland. I found a new job, a small apartment near the river, a coffee shop that remembered my order. Life started to rebuild itself in small, unremarkable pieces. One morning, while unpacking boxes, I found an old flash drive, the one Diego had given me. I'd never opened it. I hesitated for a moment, then plugged it in. It was full of screenshots, messages, photos, everything he'd promised. But tucked at the bottom was something unexpected, a folder labeled "For You." Inside was a single document. It was a letter from Diego. He wrote that he'd followed the affair from afar for months before confronting Adrian. He'd debated reaching out to me earlier, but wasn't sure if I'd believe him. "You seem like a decent man," he wrote, "and I didn't want to be part of her lies. You deserve to know the truth from someone who had no reason to lie to you." At the end, he wrote, "Closure isn't revenge. It's understanding why you can walk away." That line stayed with me. I printed the letter and pinned it to my fridge. It wasn't forgiveness, it was perspective. 6 months later, I got an email from an unknown address. The subject line said, "You were right." The message was short. "I'm sorry for everything. I hope you found peace." It was signed Lila. I didn't reply. I didn't even delete it. I just archived it and moved on with my day. Because for the first time in a long while, her words didn't matter. I'd already written my own ending. That night, I mailed 2 envelopes. One addressed to her last known workplace. One to an address in Miami that I knew Adrian no longer occupied. Both contained the same note, typed in plain black ink. "Stop worrying, it's over."